I had booked the cabin in Oregon for a much-needed solo retreat to finish my novel. Nestled deep within a forest, the cabin promised solitude and inspiration, far away from the hustle and bustle of my city life. It was the kind of place where one could lose themselves in nature, surrounded by nothing but trees, the occasional rustle of wildlife, and the soothing sounds of a remote brook, or so I hoped. The drive to the cabin was a journey in itself. The GPS took me through winding gravel roads that seemed to grow narrower and more treacherous with each mile. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The cabin was quaint, but looked like it had been abandoned for years. A charming, old-fashioned structure with wooden siding and a steep, shingled roof. It was isolated, the nearest neighbor miles away, which I initially saw as a benefit, but would soon come to regret. Inside, the cabin was musty but cozy. The furnishings were old but well kept, and the fireplace promised warmth against the chilly night air. I unpacked my bags and set up my workspace by the window, eager to get started on my writing. As the darkness fell, the only light came from the lamp on my desk and the flickering flames in the fireplace. The outside world seemed to fade away as I became absorbed in my work. Around 9 p.m., as I was lost in thought, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window behind me. At first, I dismissed it as a branch brushing against the glass, driven by the wind, but the tapping persisted, steady and deliberate, almost as if someone were tapping in a pattern. My curiosity and growing unease got the better of me. I turned around and peered into the dark outside, my eyes straining to see beyond the curtain of night. There was nothing, just the inky blackness of the forest and the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the trees. I tried to shake off the discomfort, convinced it was just my imagination. I locked the windows and closed the curtains, but the feeling of unease lingered. I told myself it was merely the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After a few more hours of writing, I decided to turn in for the night. Sleep was elusive. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard noises, scratching, rustling, and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. Each time, I would sit up in bed, heart racing, only to find the room silent and still. The dark was oppressive, and the solitude felt heavier than it had during the day. The second night was even worse. I had hoped the first night's disturbances were a fluke, but as night fell, the tapping returned, this time louder and more insistent. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or nocturnal animals, but the sound grew more rhythmic, almost deliberate, like a knock that had a purpose. Unable to ignore it any longer, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. The night air was crisp and cold, and the forest was shrouded in deep shadows. I walked around the cabin, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Every crackle of leaves or snap of a twig seemed amplified, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The tapping continued intermittently, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. I checked the windows and doors, ensuring everything was locked and secure. The tapping seemed to come from all around the cabin, almost as if it were a game being played with me. I felt a shiver run down my spine and an uncomfortable sensation of being watched. I scanned the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone or anything. As I returned to the cabin, the tapping took on a new tone, a faint, eerie whistling. It was a disconcerting, almost mournful tune that seemed to float on the breeze. It wasn't any melody I recognized, but it had an unsettling quality to it. The whistling seemed to come from the direction of the woods, adding to my growing sense of dread. I decided to stay inside, but the sounds continued throughout the night. The whistling grew louder, occasionally merging with the tapping. It was as if someone was trying to communicate, their messages conveyed through an eerie symphony of sound. I tried to write, but my concentration was shattered by the incessant noises. The night dragged on, each hour stretching into eternity. My fear compounded with every creak of the cabin and every rustle outside. I felt trapped, the cabin's cozy facade masking an underlying menace. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge. The tapping had ceased with the first light, but I was no longer willing to stay. I packed my belongings quickly, the once charming cabin now a source of anxiety and fear. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see someone watching from the windows, but there was nothing. Just the serene, untroubled woods that seemed so different in the daylight. The experience left me shaken. The cabin that was supposed to be a peaceful retreat had turned into a nightmare. I couldn't explain the tapping, the whistling, or the sense of being watched. All I knew was that the isolation I had once sought had become my worst enemy. After weeks of driving cross-country, my body ached for rest, and my mind craved a break from the endless stretches of highway. I spotted a flickering neon sign from the road: vacancy. The tiredness in my bones made me push past the nagging discomfort I felt about the motel's decrepit appearance. It was late, and I needed a place to crash for the night. The old, rundown motel was a far cry from the cozy inns I usually preferred, but I was beyond caring. I pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching on the uneven surface. The motel's office was dark, the flickering lights casting erratic shadows on the walls. I walked in, and the bell above the door let out a hollow chime. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper, a grizzled man with a permanent scowl etched into his face. "Room 12, he grunted, sliding a key across the counter without a word. I headed to my room, a narrow building with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the cold hit me like a slap. Despite the heater being on full blast, the room was frigid. The air felt damp and a shiver ran down my spine. I chalked it up to poor insulation and a worn-out heater. The room was a faded relic of another era: old floral wallpaper, a threadbare carpet, and furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1970s. I shrugged off my jacket and settled onto the bed, the mattress sagging beneath me. Exhaustion quickly began to take hold, but just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a scratching noise coming from the door. It was faint at first, almost like a distant sound. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, or perhaps some loose debris being dragged across the floor. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like something or someone was trying to get in. My heart began to race as I listened, straining to pinpoint the sound. It was irregular, sporadic, but unmistakably deliberate. I lay still, the covers pulled tightly around me, my eyes fixed on the door. The scratching was accompanied by the occasional thump, as if something heavy was being dragged against the door. I mustered the courage to get up and check the peephole. I pressed my eye against the cold metal, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was causing the noise. The hallway outside was dimly lit, casting eerie shadows that danced across the wall. But there was nothing there. The corridor was empty, and the motel seemed to have settled into an unsettling silence. As I turned back toward the bed, I noticed the temperature had dropped even further. I wrapped myself tighter in the blankets, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. The scratching continued, growing more frantic, as if whatever was outside was desperate to get in. It sounded like claws scraping against wood, punctuated by occasional guttural noises that sent chills down my spine. The fear began to claw at my rational mind, and I decided to open the door and investigate. I fumbled for the key, my hands trembling. I cracked open the door and peered into the hallway, but it was deserted. The hallway was lined with identical, unremarkable rooms, all shrouded in darkness. The flickering neon lights outside cast an eerie glow, but there was no sign of anyone or anything amiss. I stepped out into the hallway, the old carpet muffling my footsteps. The motel was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. I walked down the hallway, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The scratching had stopped, but my unease persisted. The cold seemed to follow me, seeping through my clothes and into my bones. I checked the surrounding rooms, each one looking as desolate and unwelcoming as mine. I even knocked on a few doors, but there was no answer. The hallway felt like a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I returned to my room, locking the door behind me and trying to steady my breathing. The scratching resumed almost immediately, more intense than before. I could almost feel the desperation in the noise. It was as if something, or someone, was determined to get through that door. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets, my heart pounding in my chest. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the old building seemed magnified, my fear feeding off the oppressive silence. Morning seemed like an eternity away. The scratching continued intermittently throughout the night, never quite ceasing, but never quite reaching a climax. It was as though whatever was outside was playing a cruel game with me, testing my resolve. I remained awake, eyes wide open, staring at the door, convinced that something was going to break through at any moment. When dawn finally arrived, the first light of day provided a small measure of relief. The scratching had stopped, and the coldness seemed to dissipate slightly. I packed my things quickly, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the motel. As I checked out, the clerk gave me a blank stare, seemingly unaffected by the night's events. I left the motel behind, the gravel crunching under my tires as I drove away. The sense of relief was palpable, but the memory of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of the strange, unsettling experience. The old, run-down motel had left its mark on me, a chilling reminder of how even the most mundane places can hide the most inexplicable fears.